All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to step into a kind of courtroom. We're going to hear what the source material basically calls the prosecution's closing argument against one of the world's oldest and biggest claims, the divine infallibility of the Catholic Church. And look, we're not talking about faith here. This is all about logic. So let's dive in.
Okay, so right out of the gate, we're hit with this just stunning contradiction. Picture this. Back in the 14th century, you have Pope Boniface VIII saying that for your soul to be saved, you have to be subject to him. No salvation outside the church, period. Now, flash forward to today. Your average modern priest might say something totally different, that, Muslims and Jews who follow their conscience can absolutely be saved. Here's the kicker, though. That modern priest, in 1302, he would have been branded a heretic, no question. And that medieval pope, if he showed up today, people would see him as a dangerous extremist. I mean, talk about some serious theological whiplash.
And that whiplash, that complete 180, it leads us to the big question of this whole explainer. Critics would say, look, the church's one job, its only job, was to give us a reliable, consistent map to heaven. So you have to ask, if the map itself flips upside down, does the map maker actually know the way, or are they just guessing?
This brings us right to the heart of the case against what's called the no learning curve argument. And the idea is actually pretty simple. Think about it. We expect scientists and doctors to have a learning curve, right? We want them to get better, to figure things out. But for an institution that claims to be the divine representative of an all-knowing God, a learning curve on something as crucial as the formula for eternal salvation, well, that doesn't really look like progress, does it? To a critic, that looks like a total system failure.
So let's break this argument down into its three main pillars. First, there's the one-job standard. The church's core truths weren't supposed to be discovered like gravity. They were supposed to be revealed by God. So its only job was to repeat them, not to figure it out as it went along. Second, you've got what's called the hostage problem. For hundreds of years, millions of people's consciences, their eternal fates, were held hostage by what turned out to be, well, a flawed first draft of the truth. And that leads to the third point, the Spirit-guided contradiction. I mean, if the Holy Spirit is guiding you and the Spirit knows the beginning from the end, why would it let the church teach something so terrifying, only to basically say, oops, never mind, centuries later?
And this wasn't just some abstract theological debate. This had a devastating human cost. I mean, really try to imagine this. You're a medieval peasant, and you're living in absolute spiritual terror because the church told you your unbaptized baby was definitely going to hell, a teaching that today the church gently calls incomplete. Or think about the so-called heretics who were literally burned at the stake for believing in things like freedom of conscience, a core principle the church itself would formally adopt 400 years down the road. These weren't small mistakes. They had life and death and what people believed were eternal consequences.
Okay, so that's a pretty powerful case from the prosecution, right? Now let's flip the script. Let's look at the defense. How does the church explain this, this historical mess, and the fact that God didn't just give a clear, simple formula from day one?
Well, it really boils down to two completely different ways of looking at it. On one hand, you have the skeptical view. This says there's nothing divine going on. The church is just a human invention, and its theology is basically just whatever ideology it needs to cook up to survive the current political climate. But then there's the theological view. This frames the whole 2,000-year journey not as a series of blunders, but as this long, difficult, even painful conversation between God and a humanity that is just a really slow learner.
And really, the heart of the modern church's defense comes down to this kind of thinking. Modern theologians will argue that when all is said and done, God judges a person's heart and their conscience. It's not some kind of cosmic audit to see if you subscribe to the exact right set of papal footnotes for your particular century.
So, this is the really crucial point of the defense. The official teaching today is that God isn't bound by the church's own rules or sacraments. This basically acts as a divine safety net. It means that God's mercy can step in and override the institution's historical mistakes. It can save people who might have been condemned by a teaching that was, frankly, flawed or incomplete. But, and this is a huge but, here's the twist. While that defense is really merciful and comforting, it creates this new, and you could say deeply unsettling irony. It actually forces us to ask an even more profound question about why the church is even necessary in the first place.
And that's the question right there. Let's go back to our map analogy. If the map is often wrong, but the all-knowing guide, God, is just going to make sure the traveler gets to the right destination safely anyway, then what's the point of the map maker? Especially a map maker who claims they have the only authentic map.
Yeah, the implication here is pretty stark. The Church's foundational claim that it's an absolute requirement for salvation starts to sound a lot less like a divine law and a lot more like, well, a helpful suggestion.
Now, the Church does offer one last, very complex defense. It's a theological principle called economia. The basic idea is that the core truth, with a capital T, never changes, but the Church sort of packages it differently for the world, depending on what a culture can understand or handle at the time. So, for example, in a brutal, violent medieval world, you get a really harsh black and white version of the truth. Not because it's the whole truth, but because, the argument goes, that's what was needed to keep society from completely falling apart.
But whew, the source material just fires right back at that idea with a devastating critique. It basically says, hold on, if the ultimate truth is that God's mercy is for everyone, but you tell people only Catholics get saved just to control them and keep them in line, you're not a teacher of truth anymore. You're a politician. That's not truth. That's just propaganda.
So, where does all this leave us? We've heard the prosecution's case, we've heard the defense, we've heard the rebuttal. We've reached the end of the arguments, and now it's time for the final question. The verdict, really, is up to you.
For the critic, for someone who buys that no learning curve argument, the conclusion is unavoidable. The historical record isn't some beautiful story of divine guidance. No, it's the smoking gun. It's the proof that the institution is fundamentally human, that it's reactive, not divine, that it's always just repainting the bullseye around wherever the arrow of human moral progress happens to land. And this really leaves us with two final, competing ways to see the institution. For the believer, it's all a trial of faith. The jar, the human institution, might be cracked, it might be dirty, it might be confused. But the gold, the presence of Christ, is still inside. But for the critic, the answer is way simpler. The Church doesn't lead human moral progress, it follows it, usually kicking and screaming, and only when reality forces its hand.
And so, we're going to end with the source material's final, provocative question for you to really think about. After hearing this whole logical takedown, does the problem seem to be with the very idea of organized religion itself? Or is the issue something more specific? Is it rooted in the absolutely extraordinary, unique claims to divine authority made specifically by the papacy? The answer, as always, is for you to decide.